My name is Avery. I am 25 years old. And the night my father destroyed my life work and evicted me, I had just finished a grueling 16-hour shift supervising a concrete pour at a commercial job site. I still smelled of dry cement dust and heavy sweat when I pulled into the driveway at 1:00 a.m. But as my headlights hit the front yard, my heart completely dropped. Scattered across the wet grass were the architectural balsa wood models I had spent the last 4 weeks meticulously building, smashed into splinters. My blueprint tubes were tossed into the mud, the caps off, the ink bleeding under the pouring rain. A heavy plastic crate containing my expensive laser distance meters and drafting tools had been flipped upside down, half submerged in a puddle. My father was standing under the harsh LED porch light with his iPad up, the flash glaring right into my eyes. He was recording me. To him, filming his own daughter's public humiliation was just premium content to share with the extended family. My mother stood right behind his shoulder, her arms locked tight across her chest, her face completely blank as she looked away. My 30-year-old brother, the golden child who had just lost the firm its biggest client through sheer incompetence, stood there smirking, using the toe of his shoe to grind a wet 3D rendering straight into the asphalt. "You ungrateful, selfish brat," my father bellowed, his voice echoing loudly across the quiet suburban street so every neighbor could hear. "You think just because you graduated top of your class, you can steal our firm's proprietary project data and sell it out to our competitors? You are a parasite biting the hand that feeds you. Get off my property tonight." The lights in the house across the street flickered on. I knew they were watching from behind their curtains, capturing every single second of my disgrace. I looked directly into the iPad camera pointed at my face, and instead of breaking down, I smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who had just watched a fragile illusion completely shatter. In that exact second, something inside me went dead cold. Without a word, I reached into the pocket of my high-vis work jacket. My fingers found the field laser meter. It had a built-in voice memo recording feature for site notes. I quietly clicked the button, locking the device into live audio capture. Then, I began picking up my ruined models, my soaked blueprints, and my muddy tools, tossing them into the back of my pickup truck. No crying, no begging. I refused to give them the dramatic, weeping scene they wanted for their video. Before I climbed into the driver's seat, I rolled down the window, looked at the three of them, and said very softly, "I truly hope the firm's project deadlines go smoothly tomorrow morning, without the parasite fixing your structural errors. Good luck." Have you ever been publicly destroyed by the very people who built their entire comfort on your silent labor? Because the people who threw my life onto the wet grass that night forgot one crucial thing. When you kick out the person who anchors the foundation, the whole house is bound to collapse. Before I tell you what happened over the next 14 days, and how their entire world crumbled because of a single encrypted server file, do me a quick favor. Drop a comment below right now. What time is it where you are? And what city or country are you watching this from? I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let me tell you what I did next. I didn't drive to a friend's house to cry on their couch. I didn't sit in some dark parking lot sobbing over the steering wheel either. Instead, I drove 40 miles south, crossing the county line into a gritty industrial district. I pulled my pickup truck behind a 24-hour gas station, shut off the engine, and let the silence of the cabin wash over me. Then, I pulled the field laser meter out of my pocket and hit play on the voice memo log.
My father's booming accusations.
My brother's arrogant snickering, and my mother's heavy sigh saying, "Just let her go. Richard, she brought this on herself by refusing to sign over the office equity shares." I replayed that raw audio 3 times in a row. I didn't do it because I enjoyed the pain. I did it because I needed to anchor those cruel words into my brain before they had a chance to blur. Toxic families have a terrifying superpower. They rewrite history. By tomorrow morning, they would call this a minor disagreement. By next week, they'd claim I was being dramatic. By next month, they'd tell everyone I packed up and stormed out over nothing. But a digital recording doesn't lie. It doesn't soften over time. I spent that night in a barren, drafty industrial studio apartment that I had originally rented a few months prior just to use as a private workshop for my physical models. It had a concrete floor, an old folding chair, and a single flickering overhead bulb. I dragged my mattress out of the truck bed, threw it on the floor, and established one non-negotiable rule for myself. I was never going back. At exactly 3:15 a.m., my phone began to violently buzz against the concrete floor. Then it buzzed again. And again. It was a relentless barrage of missed calls and notifications, but not a single text asked if I was safe, if I had a place to sleep, or if I was okay. Instead, the demands poured in like commands to a servant. My father texted, "What is the decryption password for the Green Park Foundation structural files? Send it now." My brother sent, "The interest payment on my truck loan is due tomorrow morning. The office account is flagged. Unfreeze the payroll portal immediately." I didn't reply to a single character. I sat there in the dim light, took a screenshot of every single text, and dragged them into a secure cloud folder labeled "The Bare Truth." By the end of the week, that folder held exactly 112 unanswered text messages and frantic voicemails. To some people, documenting everything like a lawyer might seem petty. But when your own blood humiliates you in front of the world, documentation isn't pettiness. It is survival armor. The next morning, I called the only person in the industry who always gave it to me straight, Professor Harrison, my former architecture mentor from college. He listened to the entire story, from the smashed balsa wood models to the late-night text storms, without interrupting once. When I finished, he didn't offer hollow pity. He just sighed and said, "Avery, you've been running that entire firm's structural backend for 3 years without a dime of actual equity. This isn't a family dispute. It's an unsafe structure that just finally collapsed. Do not walk back inside a burning building." His words hit me like a sledgehammer because he was entirely right. I hadn't been evicted from a loving home. I had escaped a broken system built on free labor and emotional extortion. That afternoon, I logged into my state licensing board portal. With a few clicks, I officially changed my emergency contact and my legal professional sponsor from my father's name to Professor Harrison's. It was a simple digital update, but it felt like cutting an iron chain with a pair of heavy bolt cutters. Sitting alone in the dim light of that concrete studio, surrounded by the broken pieces of my architectural models, I began to unpack the brutal reality of my situation. For 3 years, I had allowed myself to believe a massive lie. I had believed that working for my father's firm was an honor, a stepping stone, a family duty. But as I stared at the screenshots of the 112 frantic messages on my phone, the illusion completely dissolved. I was never a burden. I was never the parasite my father claimed I was. I was the unpaid infrastructure holding his entire business together. Families like mine love to maintain a narrative where the children are always indebted to the parents, regardless of how much those children sacrifice. My father drove a luxury vehicle to client meetings and played golf on Tuesday afternoons, while I was the one pulling consecutive all-nighters to recalculate the structural load-bearing capacities that my brother had completely botched. I was the one who woke up at 4:30 a.m. to deal with angry structural subcontractors on site because my brother was too hungover to answer his phone. I managed the master CAD files. I kept track of the complex municipal zoning codes, and I held the encryption keys to our secure project servers. My brother received a fat, guaranteed salary and a title he didn't earn, while I was thrown a meager family allowance that barely covered my gas and car insurance. And yet, I stayed. I stayed because they spent years conditioning me to believe that my worth was entirely dependent on my utility to them. They didn't value me as a daughter, or even as a licensed professional. They valued me as a highly efficient, silent machine that absorbed all of their failures and turned them into profit. But the real reason my father snapped and threw my life's work into the rain wasn't because I was useless. It was because, for the first time in my life, I chose to say no. The week before the eviction, my brother had secured a shady subcontracting deal for a massive commercial development. He had cut corners on the structural material costs to inflate his own commission, and he handed me a non-compliant blueprint, demanding that I sign off on the engineering safety compliance form. It was a blatant violation of building codes, a safety hazard, and a fraud that could have cost me my professional license. When I refused to sign that document, the family dynamic shifted instantly. My refusal was treated as an act of treason. My brother threw a tantrum, My mother accused me of wanting to see the family in financial ruin, and my father slammed his fist on the boardroom table, calling me an ungrateful snob who thought she was better than her own blood. That was the moment they decided to discard me. The porch light performance, the iPad recording, the public humiliation. It wasn't a disciplinary action to teach me a lesson. It was a calculated corporate execution meant to break my spirit and force me into submission. Have you ever realized that the people who complain the loudest about your lack of loyalty are actually just furious because they can no longer exploit you for free? I sat on my mattress on that cold concrete floor, looked at the rain hitting the studio window, and smiled. Because once you finally see the machinery of a toxic family for what it truly is, you realize something beautiful. Their anger is not a sign of your weakness. It is proof that you have finally reclaimed your power. While my family was busy celebrating their short-lived victory and reviewing the iPad footage of my eviction, I was already moving forward. The very next morning, I submitted my extensive portfolio to a prestigious international architectural firm downtown. They didn't care about my family drama. They only cared about my structural engineering expertise. Within 48 hours, I was hired as their new associate director of technical design. My new boss looked at my past project history and asked, "Avery, you single-handedly engineered the structural core of the city's largest commercial plaza last year. Why is your name completely omitted from the firm's public credits?" I just smiled and told him that from now on, my work would speak for itself. My new salary was more than 4 times the pathetic family allowance my father used to control me. But while my world was rapidly expanding, the fragile ecosystem of my father's firm was beginning to violently fracture. They had made the fatal mistake of confusing my silence with insignificance. They genuinely believed that anyone with a basic drafting degree could do what I did. They were wrong. By the 4th day of my absence, the corporate infrastructure they took for granted began to completely freeze up. The firm's flagship project, the Green Park Luxury Towers, was facing a strict municipal deadline for the final fire safety and structural compliance submission. If they missed this deadline, the city would halt construction, and the developers would trigger a massive liquidated damages clause. But there was a major problem. My brother, in his utter incompetence, had no idea how to compile the master architectural sheets. Whenever he tried to open the central project database, he was met with an encrypted server prompt. Before I left, I hadn't stolen any data, nor had I destroyed any company property. That would be illegal. Instead, I simply revoked the shared administrative access tokens from my personal workstation and encrypted the master link files under my own registered digital signature. I had spent years building those specific structural algorithms. They were my proprietary intellectual property under state licensing laws. My brother didn't even know what a linked server file was. He didn't understand how the architectural drawings interacted with the structural engineering back-end. For 3 days straight, the office was in complete chaos. My father was screaming at the IT department. My brother was frantically guessing passwords. And the master server remained completely locked. They had the keys to the building, but I was the one who owned the brain that made the building stand up. Without me there to absorb their errors and fix their mess under the radar, their true incompetence was finally laid bare for the entire industry to see. The beautiful thing about a system built entirely on arrogance and exploitation is that it does to require your intervention to destroy itself. Your absence alone is the catalyst. By the 8th day after my eviction, the cracks in my father's firm were no longer just internal tech issues. They had spilled out into the professional community. I found this out through a text message from Uncle Marcus, an independent drywall and framing subcontractor who had known my family for a decade. He sent me a message saying, "Avery, your dad just lost his mind in the main conference room. The Green Park developers just slapped the firm with a formal notice of default and an immediate $80,000 penalty for breaching the submission deadline. They are threatening to yank the entire Phase 2 contract if the structural links aren't delivered by Friday." But the financial bleeding was only the beginning of their nightmare. The iPad video my father had proudly recorded of my public humiliation, the one meant to prove to the extended family and his country club friends that I was an ungrateful parasite, backfired spectacularly. My brother had foolishly shared that video in a regional project management group chat to brag about how they were cleaning house. He expected applause. Instead, a senior foreman from a major concrete supply company took a screenshot of the video, showing my smashed balsa wood models and ruined blueprints soaking in the mud, and forwarded it to every major contractor in the tri-state area. The architecture and construction industry is a surprisingly small network. People talk. Subcontractors, suppliers, and site engineers all know who actually does the heavy lifting on a project. Within 48 hours, the narrative my father had carefully crafted completely dissolved. The industry didn't see a stern father disciplining an entitled daughter. They saw an abusive, incompetent corporate boss destroying the life's work of his firm's actual lead designer. The social and economic punishment from the professional community was immediate and silent.
Our primary steel and glass suppliers,
who had worked with the firm for years on flexible credit lines, suddenly altered their terms. They issued a formal notification stating that due to increased risk assessment, my father's firm was being moved to a strict 100% cash-on-delivery policy. No more rolling credit. No more monthly billing cycles. Every single piece of material for their active job sites had to be paid for upfront in cash. With their primary project penalized and frozen, the firm's cash flow completely dried up. My father had spent his entire life believing that his authority came from his title on the door. He was about to learn that in the real world, respect is dictated by your infrastructure, and he had just thrown his entire foundation out into the rain. By the 12th day of my absence, the secure cloud folder I had labeled The Bare Truth had officially accumulated 112 frantic text, messages, and unanswered alerts. The tone of their communications had completely shifted. It had devolved from arrogant commands on day 1 to desperate anger by day 5. And finally, into a venomous panic. They realized that their company was bleeding out, and no amount of screaming at the walls was going to decrypt the proprietary engineering files they needed to save the Green Park contract. At exactly 10 o'clock p.m., while I was sitting at the sleek drafting table in my new apartment, my phone began to ring. The caller ID showed my father's name. Instead of ignoring it, I reached down, activated the professional call recording application on my tablet, and slid the answer bar open. I didn't say hello. I just waited in absolute silence. The voice that came through the speaker didn't sound like the roaring tyrant who had stood under the porch, light 12 nights ago. He sounded hollow, his breath ragged, the exhaustion of countless sleepless nights weighing down every word. Yet, despite his desperation, he still tried to wrap his words in the armor of parental authority. Avery, he stammered, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and fear. This childish tantrum has gone far enough. You have sabotaged this family's business for nearly 2 weeks. The developers are threatening a full breach, and your mother is sick with anxiety over the firm's finances. You need to unlock the database and fix the disaster you've caused. I leaned back in my chair, looking out the window at the glittering city skyline. My heart rate didn't even spike. I felt nothing but a calm, clinical detachment. I haven't sabotaged anything, I replied, keeping my voice flat. I simply took my intellectual property with me when I left. Don't you dare use that tone with me, he hissed, trying to summon his old boardroom rage, though his voice cracked under the pressure. You listen to me, you ungrateful brat. If those encrypted structural links aren't delivered to the municipal board by tomorrow morning, I am filing a formal complaint with the State Architecture and Engineering Board. I will have your professional license permanently revoked for malicious destruction of corporate property. I will ensure you never draw a single blueprint in this industry again. I let the silence hang over the line for 3 agonizing seconds. When I spoke, my voice was as steady and cold as a sheet of structural steel. I didn't get angry. I didn't defend myself. I just gave him the facts. Go ahead and file the complaint. But before you do, let me remind you that under state law, all unregistered structural algorithms and master link files created by an independent consultant remain the sole intellectual property of the author. I own the copyright to those files, not you. I paused, letting him absorb the legal wall he had just run into. Then, I delivered the final blow. And this entire conversation is being recorded, just like the 112 messages you and your son have sent me this week. If you attempt to tarnish my license, my next phone call will be to the legal counsel representing the Green Park developers. and I will hand them the complete audio recording of you, demanding that I forge code-compliant signatures on an unsafe building last month. Let's see whose career ends first." The line went completely dead. There was no screaming, no counter-argument, no desperate threats. Just the heavy, terrified sound of his breathing before the call abruptly disconnected. For the first time in my life, I felt the sheer, weightless power of absolute independence. The man who had used guilt and the illusion of family loyalty to enslave my talent for years had just been completely dismantled by a handful of cold, hard facts. On the 14th day after my eviction, the reality of their crumbling empire finally forced my father to step out of his boardroom and come to me. It was late afternoon, during that gray twilight hour, when the industrial district felt completely abandoned. I was working at my studio desk, analyzing a set of blueprint schematics for my new corporate team, when the heavy shadow of a vehicle passed my window. I looked out and saw a battered, dust-covered work truck belonging to one of our former site foremen. My father stepped out of the driver's seat. He wasn't wearing his tailored executive suit or his gold watch. He looked smaller, his shoulders hunched under a faded canvas jacket, his hair visibly whiter than it had been 2 weeks ago. The dark, hollow circles under his eyes told me everything I needed to know. The $80,000 contract penalty and the frozen supply lines had kept him awake for days. He walked up to my iron studio door, his steps hesitant, a sharp contrast to the aggressive man who had kicked my models into the mud. I opened the door but stood firmly in the center of the frame, my arms crossed, deliberately blocking the entrance. He looked past me into the clean, organized space filled with high-end drafting equipment and new corporate project boards. He tried to force a soft, paternal smile, but it looked incredibly empty. "Avery," he said, his voice dropping into a gentle, reasonable tone he had never used with me before. "We need to talk. Can I come in? Your mother and I have been worried sick about you." "You can say whatever you have to say right here," I replied. He swallowed hard, looking down at his worn boots before meeting my eyes. He tried to deploy the classic family script, the ultimate gaslighting weapon toxic parents use when they realize they no longer hold the cards. "Look, about that night, things got out of hand. I was under a lot of pressure because of the firm's finances. I only recorded that video and moved those models because I wanted you to understand accountability. It was tough love, for the sake of the family business. We're a family, Avery. We're supposed to stick together when things get rough." I looked at the man standing in the cold twilight, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel the urge to scream or defend my honor. I just felt a deep, clinical pity for how pathetic his manipulation had become. "The family business?" I asked softly, my words cutting through the quiet evening air. "Did you want me to look at the bigger picture? Or did you just want me to remain a silent, unpaid slave to my brother's laziness and your vanity? When I pulled 16-hour shifts, you told me it was my duty. When you smashed my life's work in the rain to humiliate me on camera, you called it a lesson. But now that the servers are locked, your cash flow is dead, and the firm is facing bankruptcy, you show up at my door and call it family." His gentle facade instantly cracked, and the ugly, desperate truth leaked out. "You don't understand," he burst out, his hands trembling as he stepped closer. "The Green Park developers are preparing to sue us into liquidation. Your brother's career will be ruined before it even starts, and everything I built will be gone. You have the decryption codes, Avery. You can't just stand there and watch your own blood drown over a minor disagreement." I took a half step back, my hand gripping the edge of the heavy iron door. "Watch me," I whispered, looking straight into his panicked eyes. "You built your entire legacy on my uncredited labor and expected me to smile while you handed the rewards to a son who can't even read a basic structural link. The collapse of your firm isn't a disaster I created. It is the natural consequence of your own arrogance. Now, turn around and get off my property. Because if you stand on my doorstep for one more minute, I will email the evidence of your compliance frauds directly to the developer's legal team. Let's see how fast they accelerate that lawsuit." My father froze. The last remaining shred of his unearned authority evaporated into the cold night. Without another word, he turned around, climbed back into his borrowed truck, and drove away. I closed the iron door, slid the deadbolt into place, and walked back to my drafting table without looking back once. The final collapse of a toxic structure doesn't always happen in a dark room. Sometimes it is laid bare under the brightest, most public lights. 1 week after my father left my studio door, I found myself standing in the grand ballroom of a luxury downtown hotel. I was attending the International Green Architecture and Innovation Awards. I was dressed in a sharp, tailored black suit, standing alongside the senior partners of my new firm. That evening, our team won the prestigious Gold Prize for Sustainable Commercial Design, and my name was read aloud as the lead technical engineer for the entire project. As the applause echoed through the hall, I looked out at the sea of industry professionals who were queuing up just to shake my hand, and that was when I saw them. My family was standing near the back of the ballroom, hovering by the edge of the catering tables. They hadn't been invited as honored guests. They had managed to get basic entry passes through a minor building material vendor just to desperately look for small subcontracting leads to save their failing business. They had already been forced to sell my father's luxury car and dissolve their main office space just to pay off initial Green Park default penalties. They looked completely out of place, weathered, exhausted, and small. As I walked toward the lobby to clear some space from the crowd, my brother stepped forward, intercepting me near the lounge. The old arrogant smirk was entirely gone from his face. His shoulders slumped, his eyes were bloodshot, and his expensive leather shoes looked scuffed. "Avery," he whispered, his voice cracking with intense humiliation. "Please, you have to listen to me. The office accounts are fully frozen. Beau and Mare aren't sleeping. I know we shouldn't have thrown your things into the yard, but we're drowning here. Just give us the master server links. I'm begging you." I looked at him, the brother who used to laugh while ruining my designs. "You're not sorry you treated me like garbage, Brandon," I said, my voice dead calm. "You're only sorry because you finally have to stand on a construction site under the sun and do actual work, and you realized you don't have the brains to do it without me." He flinched, tears of pure shame welling up in his eyes right there in front of his peers. My mother quickly rushed over, grabbing my forearm with a trembling hand, her voice frantic. "Avery, look at where we are. People in the industry are already staring at us. Don't do this to your own blood. Don't destroy your father's legacy over your stubborn pride." I gently but firmly removed her hand from my arm, looking her straight in the eyes. "The family legacy was destroyed the exact second you stood on that porch, folded your arms, and let him record my humiliation for the world to see. Your neutrality wasn't innocence, Mom. It was complicity." My father stepped up last. He looked at the heavy gold trophy in my hand, then at the executive badge pinned to my jacket. He opened his mouth to speak, but the sheer weight of my new reality silenced him. He realized that his unearned power had vanished. I looked at the three of them one last time and delivered my final, quiet verdict. "I am never coming back to your firm, and the destruction of your business isn't my doing. It is simply what happens to your entire life when I finally stop holding it up for you." Later that night, after the gala had ended and the parking lot was completely empty, I stood alone by my pickup truck under the cool night sky. I pulled out my field laser meter, went into the archive, and opened the audio file from the night on the lawn. I listened to my father's roaring voice and my brother's cruel laughter for exactly 5 seconds. Then, I hit delete permanently. I didn't delete it because they deserved forgiveness. I deleted it because I didn't need the proof anymore. The consequences had already arrived, delivered by their own incompetence. I had learned the hardest, most liberating lesson of my entire life. Sometimes, walking away from your family is not an act of betrayal. It is the only honest thing you can do to save your own life and force them to face the hollow reality of what they are, without you there to absorb their damage. If the people who claim to love you only value the quiet version of you, the useful version of you, the compliant version of you, then walking away is your first step toward real freedom. And here is the final question I want to leave with you tonight. Are you brave enough to close the door on the people who call your exploitation love? Or are you still staying small and suffering, simply because you're terrified of being called ungrateful?